Briefly, I want to introduce Dr. Kidd. Clay did it last week, and this week I want to introduce him with a few other lines that I thought were interesting and also kind of funny. But I asked him to tell me some things about himself, and his comment was, I started off thinking I'd spend my life happily as an anthropologist. I also thought myself a settled-in atheist, but then everything got blown up by an instantaneous conversion experience. I came to Vanderbilt Divinity School to try to understand more about Jesus, who had so totally, top to bottom, reconfigured my life. He met Pam, and we went on to serve an ex-coal camp in southeastern Kentucky. Then they came back to Nashville to minister to the Hillsboro Presbyterian Church, where he was for 37 years. And then he said, I retired, sort of. We can see he's not fully retired as we ask him to teach. But he joined faculty as an adjunct member and taught New Testament. So we're glad that you're around, and we may like to I'm glad to see you taught New Testament. We may ask you if you're willing to do that sometime in the future for us too, if you would.
Well, why don't we wait till after tonight and you can see whether you even want it.
All right, so David, we thank you for being here. Glad everyone's here, and I ask everyone if you would, to mute your microphones so that the background noises don't interrupt while he's talking. But if you want to ask a question, either just raise your hand like this, and I'm sure he'll stop and ask, or you can click on that little sign that says hand on your screen. But David, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. I thought tonight, since we under my semi-leadership, ricocheted all over the place, that I would try to set us going by going through some notes, reviewing the first chapter of Genesis, so we can kind of get a takeaway vision of what it has to offer, with a little bit of science on top of it to deepen our understanding of the dynamics of it. And then moving into chapters 2 and 3, what we're going to see is a profile, kind of an archetype of the human condition. And so we'll work our way there. But I'd like to lay out some of this territory first, just so we can have something substantial to talk about. And if that's all right with you all, if that's a game plan that's okay with you all, then that's what I'll do. Okay, that's all right, boss. That's it then. Well, what we see in the first chapter is, as was pointed out by, I think, Clay and Roy, is we see most essentially the who of the creation, the God of creation, the creator, the power, the unmeasurable, unspeakable power of God, which when God speaks, the creation springs forth. And we also see the what, which is the creation, the sun and the moon.
There's somebody.
Beg your pardon? Somebody had? Okay. So we see, so we've got the what and we've got the who, which are the essential points, the most important points of the Genesis passage. What you'll notice is there's no how. There's nothing that tells us how God did this. And so this is where we can open the door for science to come in and bring some flesh around that causative skeleton that God gives us in this story. So first up, what comes to my mind when I hear this story, the creatio ex nihilo, the creation of nothing, is the Big Bang. They sync with one another really quite well. The unfolding of days through the parts of the creation, the seas, the land, plants on the land, creatures on the land. Is somebody? I'm not sure I understand what's going on.
Someone's not on mute.
Right,
everybody would mute their phones.
So I just keep going.
And when they do that, I'm trying to mute them as fast as I can.
That's okay. No, I just wonder what it was. Okay, so what we have is this motion, this movement of life through time. And I don't think we want to miss that. There is a developmental aspect to this story. We come at this through a certain field of theology called process theology. But we see it right there. God is moving things ahead day by day by day by these time frames. And so God says, let there be light, bam. The whole thing is exploding. And we know about what happens through our sciences that follow. And for true wonderment, it's not difficult to find that there. I mean, what we get is a picture of this creation way beyond anything that these first tellers of the story could possibly know. And it's all glorious. I mean, some of it's terrible. It's terrifying. It's horrible. It's exquisite. Its reach and scale and depth and complexity and intricacies are all beyond comprehension, literally. And so that's the task of science, to try to get a hold of this. How does it work? Why does it work this way? How did we get here? I want to make the point that when Adam takes dominion, so Adam it comes in God's image. That was the first real stopping point we had to begin to examine what's going on here. And when Adam takes dominion, it's not unlike what happens in the evolution of our species. We have the development of the mind, of thought. It's a world unto itself. And once we move over out of the natural world into that world, we have the capacity to take dominion. We can make plans. We can take a piece of stone, and according to the design we have in our own heads, we can flake it or chip it, depending on how we work the stone, to create a tool. That moves forward. We have language. We can tell one another what's going on from generation to generation. And so our body of knowledge can accumulate. This is not something native to the animal world. Young can learn things like migratory routes and things like that, but we have this extraordinary capacity that takes place up in this world here. And so the dominion that is taken, that God is giving us, comes to us via the vehicle of our brain, of these trillions of neurons and trillions of synapses that are firing all the time. And so in this way we take dominion. Well, that's exactly what happened. We can trace the development of the rise of Homo sapiens, the other hominids that lived at the same time. Some of them having some of this capacity, but not nearly as much. And it is what propels us in a remarkable speed through the ages to become the dominant force on this earth, to our own, possibly our own detriment. Certainly, we have not done well with upkeeping the garden. I thought, Roy, you and Clay brought in the inevitability of this anthropomorphic impulse we have, and that's important. We're going to see in the following chapters that God goes walking in the garden. So it's very common in early creation myths for the gods or for God to have this human-like aspect. And so when we are created in God's image, so our tendency is to turn around and mirror that outwards where God is in our image. And that's kind of an inevitability. We can see it very easily in these primitive stages, but we do it ourselves because we are bound. We are bound by the management tool that our evolution has given us. We can think, But the point has been made by Kant and other philosophers for a long, long time. We can't actually know what's there. Our capacity to think is what has gotten us here, has given us our technology, but it's a capacity to work the world. It's a management tool. And we need to understand that so that we divide our world up according to our own thoughts. And they're, in some important respect, absolute final respects, unattached to reality. What is really out there, we don't know and we can't know. And I think it's kind of important to keep that in mind when we think about when we bring in God, because we're talking about something we can't access. And we want to be very humble in our understanding of. I had a very close friend who was a Muslim, and we were a part of an association where we were working with to try to, quiet the anti-Islamic business blowups that were happening a couple of years ago, and so we would meet with friends who were Jewish and with other Muslims. And a few of us Christians. And he made the point over and over, and he's quite right. We tend to think of Islam as a rather rigid religion, no more than ours. He made the point, we cannot know who God is. So I hope that's clear. I mean, the magnitude of God escapes us. If you want to know about the creation itself, and you really want to get some appreciation for it, you want to know about the skies, sit down with an astrophysicist for about 10 minutes. You want to know about our history, the complexity and intricacies of our bodies and the lives of creatures that have lived. Sit down with an evolutionary biologist. And if you really want your mind just blown right out your ears and your eyeballs rolling down your cheeks, sit down with a physicist and ask them to tell you about quantum mechanics. So this is what science can give us. It's the how it works and the where we came from. And we have this wonderful evolutionary management tool, but that's where we end. The point was made, let me get off that. The point was made, finally, I think it's a very important for those of us who are Christians. We believe ultimately what it means to be in God's image, we see in Jesus. He is our understanding of the perfect image of God in human form. And all the precursor comments I was making about the limitations we have come into play because what we can know about God, we Christians believe, we can see in Christ. But
David, are you ready to take a question? Somebody's got their hand up. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I don't want to lose too much time before we get to the third chapter. Sure, go ahead.
But Chris, if you will unmute, you have a question?
Thank you very much. And thank you, David, so much for taking your time. I'm visiting in from Long Beach. I love getting Woodmont's so many fantastic programs. So thank you again to Pastor Stauffer and the team. David, just to be clear, you are a Christian trying to make evolution work inside of the creation model, or you are evolutionary biologist and there's something about being a Christian and those two could correlate? Because I'm hearing what I tend to hear, and I ask from a point of view as it's what I coach different pastors and Christians on, is there is the process of evolution, man included, and then there's, pardon me, let me decline that, and then there is a book called Genesis.
Right.
So I just want to be clear because you began to name the evolutionary tree of Homo, and as we arrive, and then you kind of made one of those Christian leaps.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Let me rephrase the question.
Yeah.
Are you grounded in creation, or are you grounded in evolutionary biology? And then there is something called creation, which helps us explain the world that we didn't know how to explain at the time that the Bible was written.
Right. I'll repeat the point that Roy made. I was an anthropologist for some years, and then I had this conversion experience. So my sense of the authority, the divinity that lies behind the infinitudes of this creation, of our humanness and all the dimensions of our universe, point to God. I see evolution, or I see the stories of Genesis as these early accounts of what happened, how we got here, and who brought us here. I don't see any serious conflict unless I try to become a literalist, a biblical literalist, and that's going to collapse. That won't work. For one reason, it stumbles all over itself if you know anything about the scriptures. The other is it simply doesn't handle what happened, what we bring from science. I don't see a conflict that's necessary. I think it's terribly unfortunate that religion has so often tried to obstruct the worlds that science offers. We see it in Galileo and the earlier people who was Copernicus and people like that on through the ages. That's not necessary, but it's anchored in literalism and so kind of problems. It's one of the things that has made as many atheists as there are. I don't see literalism as at all helpful. I do think the claims of the central claims of Genesis hold, and I think we can enrich those claims with what we learn in science. That's what I would say. I don't know whether that works or not.
Almost, and I apologize for asking. The title is Creation and Evolution.
Right.
And as an anthropologist, then I know you could trace from Australopithecus afarensis all the way through to Homo sapien, and that does not need to include dirt and a rib, 2 men, 1 woman. So even if I'm not a literalist, the story breaks down. But I get that for some, that to have that story matters, because without that story of creation, it really puts people on unsteady ground. So much so it's easier to believe it than to not.
Yeah, I would say that from my experience as a minister, the thing that people are frightened by science, people of faith can be frightened by science. What I want to do is take the story and bring in the insights that science has provided us about this creation that God made. I don't want to spend more time on that, but that would be my point. I think that it's an unfortunate opposition. It doesn't need to be there. They can enrich one another. I can be an evolutionist, which I am, and I can also believe God used evolution as the tool to get the world done, which I do. So that's kind of the summary of it. Let me go on. Let's go on.
Thank you for taking the question. I appreciate it.
That's all right. I just, yeah.
Can I summarize that discussion real quick for people that may get confused in that dialogue? And this is a simple way. I do simple things and say simple ways. But again, to me, the Bible, tells us to answer the question why. Science tells us how. And therefore, I've never had any conflict between science and religion. Now, go ahead. Keep going, David.
Yeah. I'm 100% on board, Roy. I do understand the problems that have been raised. I mean, I think Chris is right. For a lot of people, it's a problem. I want to say it doesn't have to be. Okay, let's move on. What we discover, as I said at the outset, in 2 and 3, is a veritable archetype of human nature, of the human condition. So, and I would say to Chris, kind of stand by the development of this, because here, some of the details that you could quickly throw out would be a shame to throw out, because they provide a kind of peek inside of our nature in this story, in the structure of the story. So we start off, we're in the image of God. Okay, I think we all have that. And the image, the perfect image is Jesus. We believe, we Christians believe. But at the very least, we have a loving God because we believe that's the nature of God and that's what we're to do. So, so that provides some kind of idea about what it means to be in God's image. We do what God does. We have dominion. God gives us that in our minds. We can think, we can judge, and we can take power. We can exercise power over the creation. We can know God, not in the sense that we actually attach to the real God, which, as Tillich says, is the real God. The true God is the God beyond God. And just kind of let that float for a second. But we do hunger for God. That's there in us. All right, so we start off with the power of being in the image of God, with the beauty of being in the image of God, and we're to act like children of God. What we say, and Jesus gives us a full blast of this. How did we get so screwed up? I mean, that becomes the interesting question that enters the story in 2 and 3. This is the older story, incidentally. It's written probably around in the 6th century BC, but I think probably was told around campfires, probably at least 1,000 years before that. And so we can appreciate somewhat the earlier quality of things. Not quite so clean as the first chapter. Before there's anything on earth, any living thing on earth, God creates Adam out of the dust of the earth, out of dirt, and God breathes the breath of life into Adam. Adam comes alive after God has breathed the breath of life into him, and it's and here it's helpful to understand Adam. One of the Hebrew meanings of Adam is the earthling. It's not simply a man; it's humankind, and we use the word man for centuries in that manner. We've been led to a higher level of sensitivity around the need to recognize that's exclusionary. Also, it tends to push women to the edge, which is not the intention of the passage. So we start off, we have an uninhabited world. God takes the dust of the ground in this story, which, as I say, is a more primitive story, breathes the breath of life into this creature, and it's off and running. And then God brings the fruits and the grains and the plant yielding seeds to Adam, to the garden. You'll note at this point we are vegetarian. There aren't any animals yet, so we have the garden, and the garden is producing all this fruit and all this food, and it's beautiful. It's good. And then in the midst of the garden is the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We're not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We don't have to worry about the tree of life at this point because we already have life. We don't die. We don't have to worry about living forever at this point. So, but we do have to stay away from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in that moment when we eat that fruit, we will die, says God. And but God sees that's not enough for the man. And so God creates animals. And now we've got the animals of the earth and the sea and the birds of the air and all these helpers for the man. And God gives to the man the power to name. This is one of those little details that we don't want to miss, because naming has power. And the ancient people, actually in many civilizations, understood this. I think I see my friend Jim Schleicher here, as a therapist, can tell you names, words have power. And these people understood that. They understood that to name something provided, at least to some degree, a sense of ownership. In addition to that, language, we know, carves up our world. It has that power. It provides for us the categories of our culture, our understanding of how the world is organized. All that comes to us in language, these words and the verbs and the adjectives and adverbs that describe them. So language has this tremendous power, and the early Hebrews understood that power. And we can see aspects of that in the prophets. It was believed when a prophet spoke, God forbid, when that word went out from the prophet, it took on a life of its own. It was dangerous. That statement by the prophet was dangerous. You could kill him, and if that word was out there, it was going to work its way out. So I think we need to appreciate first the understanding of language in these earlier times, and then the actual power that it does bring. All right, so now we've got the plants, and now we've got the animals, and now we see that God is looking, and it's not enough. There's something missing for poor Adam, and he's wandering around lost with a day's look in his eye and lonely. And he's got all his animal buddies, and he's got all the food to eat, but there's something missing. And so Adam is put to sleep. God decides he's going to give Adam a helper. And so he puts the man to sleep. And we know the plan here. I don't know whether God had this in mind when God created women, but he's going to give a man who we know, Roy, you and I, is the useful half. We're disposable, but the woman is the useful half. And they remind us of that. And Pam and I enjoy coffee every morning, and we've got these 2 coffee cups, and one has this big bold that's mine, Mr. Right. And then Pam has one that says Miss Always Right. And that's often the way it worked out, and that's the way I'm told it works out also. So Adam gives up a rib and gains a mate. So now the question is appropriately added, what is the forbidden fruit here? What is the meaning of this as we move forward? There have been 100 opinions, hundreds of opinions given by early biblical students. We can see iterations of it, centuries before Christ. And certainly after that, this forbidden fruit, what it is. What this fruit does, you can see this in the warning, because the fruit will give you the knowledge of good and evil. What this fruit does, in fact, and also we can see an evolutionary aspect here. I'm not getting fancy here. I'm talking about something very real. This fruit opens up a knowing. It opens up a whole different kind of world. And now we enter into this world of the mind. All of us are in it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking to one another. And it's a world we cannot get out of. It's a world of our own creating. Adam, now, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is a world that opens up the world of thought, the world of the knowledge of right and wrong and gray and white and so on and so forth. That's the world that opens up. And that world, the knowledge of the difference between good and evil, we can see it right early. We can see the hungers that it opens up, the problems, the separations that it opens up with, as Tillich again says, with the ground of our being. Because we see this hunger in cave art. We see it in these burial artifacts, this hunger for something more, this hunger to control the world that we're in some way that isn't simply with flint. We can represent a wild bison, and maybe the fates will give us access to that for food for our family. But we can also see this hunger for life after death. And remember what God says now. the day you eat it, you will die. Well, at this point, when we enter into this world of abstractions, we become aware of that fact. And we know we will die before the death comes. And we know the death is coming. And that frames a lot of our lives. So this is not, and we can see the hunger of this. We can see the face of it. We see it in the late Pleistocene. These creatures frightened, haunted by the night, by the thunder, by the uncertainties of life, by the death of children and loved ones, by the death of self. It's a frightening world that is opened when we enter this world of the knowledge of good and evil. And I'm going to try to say that this, where again, I'm not stretching something here. And there are extraordinary insights into human nature here. These creatures are languishing, and having the good life, and before they eat, and then something very interesting happened. The serpent comes. So there they are. They're having a great time. The serpent comes. They don't know anything about good and evil. They don't know they're naked. They don't know any of that. They're just enjoying the fruits of life that God has given. The serpent is not Satan. And there's been an inclination in the church and among Christians to call that Satan. It's not Satan. The snake is a natural creature. It is the subtlest creature in the garden. Subtle. The snake says to the women, "Did God say you can't eat any tree in the garden?" Of course, he says, "No, we can eat any tree, but we can't eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because then if we touch it, we die." The serpent says back to Eve, "You will not die." God knows when you eat that, your eyes are going to be open and you're going to be like God and you're going to know the difference between good and evil. So here we got Eve facing a primordial decision. Who is going to be God? God who said, "Don't eat it"? The snake who's saying in her left ear, "It's not going to hurt you. God knows that you'll know this and you'll be like God." And so who's the arbiter of that decision? So she gives the fruit to Adam. And now they're both arbiters of who can decide this life and death decision. And the question is it going to be God? We know what God has said. Or is it going to be, or am I going to decide what I'm going to eat? And that's what Adam and Eve do. They decide what they're going to eat. And essentially, they become God in their own life in the sense of to what do they subordinate themselves? It's not the word of God. It's not God. It's this world of grays and shades where they can make happen what they want to have happen and have an excuse for it. I hope we can feel the dynamics of this. These are these first creatures. They enter this world where this world of infinite grays, where they could find their way through to have their will and excuse their way on in. And what do we see happening? Exactly that. So God is out taking a walk in the garden. Adam and Eve have hidden themselves because now they know they're naked. They know they're exposed. Think of all the things that means. They're vulnerable. So they hide, and God says, "What have you done?" And Adam says, "Well, I knew I was naked. I was afraid, and so we hid." And God said, "Well, how'd you find out you're naked?" So what does Adam do here? Watch what Adam does. It was the woman. It was the woman who you gave me the woman, and it was the woman who gave me the fruit. So this is passing the apple. What does the woman say? Well, God says, "What have you done?" Well, the woman says, "It was the snake. It was. I'm going to jump ahead. It was the subtleties of the creation It was the snake that gave me the fruit. So what we've got here is this excuse making made possible because this is the world we live in, and we know the dynamics of this. So she sees that the fruit is good for food and a delight to the eyes, and it's desired to be made to make one wise. We're talking about being God, essentially, aren't we? I mean, if we carve it down to the bone, we're going to know what God knows, and we want that. So their eyes are open, and now God, in the cool of the day, has caught them. And this is the world of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, the world of morality, the world of rules and broken rules, the world where we need law, we need norms, we need one another to exert pressure, or we become lost. Something that had not happened before. A pre-human creature lives out of impulse, out of instinct, out of this fundamental biological need to breed, to leave fertile offspring. Well, we're free from that. And what we see in the following chapter, in 4, is exactly how that carries out when Cain slays Abel. But so from this point forward, and we'll go back and collect this, but from this point forward, God's entire effort with us becomes to help this creature, the man and the woman, live a sensible, moral, and fulfilled life. And when you think about it, everything that follows is God trying to get us back, trying to bring us life, trying to bring us back to how God has created us originally. And we see this followed on through the New Testament. So, but I want to sharpen the point of this business of our ability to get around things that is ubiquitous in the human experience. We all do it, and we all do it all the time. I love this comment that C.S. Lewis makes. He's got this great description of a man becoming a lawbreaker. Listen to what he says. This was the first thing Mark had been asked to do, which he himself, before he did it, clearly knew to be criminal. But the moment of his consent almost escaped his notice. Certainly there was no struggle. There was no sense of turning a corner. For him, it all slipped past in a chatter of laughter, of that intimate laughter between fellow professionals, which of all earthly powers is strongest to make men do very bad things before they are yet individually very bad men. And this is the Adamic sin. That moment when we separate ourselves from God, and we essentially determine to become our own God. And we all do this. And as I say, we all do it all the time. Just think about Christ's admonition and early Adam to be solely subordinate myself to the will of God. How much do we do that? How easily I can use the Jesus concern about mammon and get my way around it. I mean, we're living a relatively modest life, and it's 100 times more than we need. I don't know what your circumstances are, but we live in a warm house. We've got books and everything we need. Outside the door, somebody's hungry. Now, if I was to do what Jesus said, I'd become a universal donor. But I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to find a way to thank God for all I've got. Thank you, God. And make sure I keep control of most of it. And we all do that. We do it with our sex lives. As Jesus said, the law of adultery, thou shalt not commit adultery. And Jesus says, when you begin to lust, you already are dehumanizing that person and making them an object of your desire. We all do that. And we have that exposed in a kind of quivering essence right here in this story. We see ourselves laid bare, and we because we live in this world in our heads, in this moral world of good and evil, we've got determinations to make, and we've got to make them all the time. Decisions. Who am I going to count as God? And, you know, we can just hope and pray that for the most part, who we count as God is God. I mean, that's where our lifelong pilgrimage comes, isn't it? We pursue a higher, more perfect life, which we believe, because we see it in Christ, will give us the fulfillment that God has put the potential in us to experience. But it's a hard walk. It's a hard thing to do. It's a constant journey. And as has been pointed out, the better we get at it, the more aware we are of the problems we have, the more aware we are of our failings. Like, so Paul ends up saying, you know, I want to do good, but the thing that I do is not the good that I want to do. I do the bad thing I don't want to do. Now, I don't know about you all, but I can recognize that very quickly. I mean, I feel that every time I do a good work, there's some kind of haunting voice like, yeah, fine, pat yourself on the back, but there's more. And I'm not going to go to the more. So, okay. So essentially what happens is we separate ourselves.
Jenny Mahomes. Dad.
Yeah. Who am I speaking to?
Go ahead.
Hey, hon. That's my wife. So what happens here, the dynamic of what happens here is that we separate ourselves from God. And being human separates us from God. The moment I develop a sense of self, I'm over against a threatening world. I become anxious. And that anxiety creates I create boundaries around myself, inevitably. You know, it's interesting. People will say, well, there's no such thing as original sin. Here's a fact. It's not really entirely a biblical thing. It really begins to get developed by St. Augustine in the 4th century. So it begin to take its actual shape that we recognize. But if you look at a baby is about the baby. There's nothing more about self than a baby is about self. And it has to be, doesn't it? And as the child grows up, it learns to open its world out to include more and more people, but the I it remains the center. And this long journey that I've referenced is a journey to be able to put the I to the back, as Jesus says, to become self-giving in our love, the way Christ is, the way we see God being, the way we believe that we're created to be. Well, I think I was going to try to go into a little bit about the dynamics of how this might work existentially, but let me just stop and see what we've got.
I have a couple of things to say. First of all, I, of course, respect your opinion, but I disagree with a lot of what you've said. To start with, several things. I'm not even sure I can remember them all, but start with the serpent was inhabited by Satan, and it's in multiple places in the Bible. Revelation 12:9 says, that ancient dragon, that ancient serpent.
You're jumping ahead. Well, I'm talking about the story, the Hebrew story in Genesis. I'm not talking about Revelation, which was done at the last part of the 1st century, and its belonging in the Bible has been problematic right up to Luther. But I'm not talking about that passage. I'm talking about this passage. So I take
the Bible as one story. It's one book.
I know
it's the revelation of God, and it's infallible. And there's no book on the face of this earth beside the Bible that is infallible. Beside it, nothing. I'm a scientist. I'm a doctor. I've been exposed to a lot of science.
What do you mean by infallible?
Well, we can. That would be a debate for hours.
All right. So let's don't have that. Okay.
But what I'm saying is that most Hebrew scholars, or a lot of them, agree that the Hebrew word for day, yom, means a 24-hour day in this context. And there are several reasons for that. One, because it's not linked with a preposition, which as in the day. And the other thing is it's related with a cardinal number, day 1, day 2, day 3. Those are instances where we're talking about a 24-hour day. So I believe in 24/7 creation. And
you believe in 24 hours?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I tell you what, there are a lot of people that do, and there are a lot of scientists that since about last 3 or 4 decades that are coming more and more to that way of thinking. Because I
don't want to take everybody else's time up here, Chip, but I would be interested in knowing how you account for evolution, which takes place over, as you know, then billions of years.
Let's talk about that.
Back to the beginning of the Cambrian, where we begin to see life forms.
How old is
that's a half a billion years ago.
How old do evolutionists say that, and the scientists that believe in that say the universe is? I think I know, but I just.
How do they say what?
The universe. The universe.
13.7 billion years is what they're estimating.
And the Earth. And the Earth.
And the Earth, 5 something.
And the Earth is about 4.5 billion. That's what they say, right?
Not 5 billion.
4.5 billion. Okay, so there's a huge problem there. The Earth was created on day 1, right? The luminaries, the star, the sun, and the moon, and the stars were created on day 4.
We're going to go around in circles here. You're arguing out of a viewpoint of kind of literalism. I don't buy it. I honor it. I mean, I think that's your right. And if it gives you comfort and frames your world in a livable way, which clearly it does, then I have no criticism of it. I'm bringing my own opinion. That's all I'm doing. And
right. But I mean, I have other church members in my family here listening to this.
There are other people here. I've got my opinion. I was a scientist. I'm somewhat of a theologian and a New Testament scholar. I know what's in the Bible. This is the way I understand it. I understand the way you understand it. I've seen it 1,000 times. I've seen it in my students. I saw it when I was an anthropologist. I see it when I'm a New Testament teacher. So I understand that. I don't mean to dishonor it. I'm just telling you. Let's agree to disagree on that. And let's move on and open the way.
Can I just make one other comment? Just one other comment. In my way of thinking, the Westminster Confession says that chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, right? Okay. In my way of thinking, we do not honor God. We do not glorify God if we give impersonal evolution credit for creation. And also, if there are a bunch of people living and he was made out of the rib.
Have the last thing that Darwin says in The Origin of Species, the last thing he said.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay, all right. That's worth keeping in mind. Why on earth would we make the creation of the heavens and the earth and evolution and all that sort of stuff impersonal? Why don't we say this is a mechanism that we can access because we're human, we're limited. We can access this and we can come to understand how God's pulling this off. But I don't have to back 1 inch in saying it's not God working it. I mean, I'm a person of faith believes.
David, I'm going to, if I can, as the moderator of this, let you and invite you and Chip, if you want to have a continuing conversation on debating that ongoing question that you laid out so well.
That goes on forever, as you know.
Well, it has gone on for over 1,000 years, but I want I'd like to ask you a question in light of that we're studying creation and we're studying Genesis, and that you're being a Presbyterian. Could you speak your thinking on this question you mentioned a while ago of original sin? And you mentioned Augustine, who, yes, got it incorporated into the Catholic Church because he was more powerful than Pelagius, who argued differently.
Right, yeah, exactly.
But Augustine got him excommunicated. You know how power structures work. But, you know, can you speak to the idea of original sin?
Well, it's probably, you know, it's fairly, it's pretty Calvinistic. The Catholic Church doesn't embrace this idea that original sin is everlasting sin. You can be redeemed by partaking of the body and blood of Christ, and that restores you. It gets you past, you know, the curse, momentarily anyway. But most Presbyterians recognize the fallibility of being human, which so I mean I think we would move, Roy, pretty quickly over into kind of an existential description of what's going on, and in our experiences, our fudging and all that sort of stuff. It's there. I think it's there from the day we become human. I don't know if that helps at all, but that's kind of my view.
So from the day we become human,
aware, self-aware.
Sin is there, or tendency to sin is there.
Yeah, the tendency. Well, the tendency is always. So these Tillichian, I keep going back to Paul Tillich. I shouldn't, but but in this territory is pretty good. He makes the point, and I think it's a valid point. A sin is not an act. I'm sure you know this of Tillich. It's not action. It's a state of being. We are in sin. This inevitable impulse we have that pushes us out into our life is drenched in this kind of sense of self and the anxieties that produces and all that sort of stuff, and it sets us over against God, who before whom we will not submit ourselves entirely. And so we separate. So this separation from God becomes the original sin, and it's there. And I think we all experience it. So it's an existential description. I don't know if that helps or not, but I don't like. I mean, I don't know about you, Roy, but I don't spend a lot of time on that. I mean, but yeah. I can't hear you.
If you can, I was had to unmute. And, you know, in our churches, it becomes a question. I had it raised, you know, a question of baptism last night in a small group discussion, some new people. And, you know, the question about why do Presbyterians baptize infants? Why do we not baptize, you know, until we call it an age of understanding, which is.
Oh, that's where you go. Okay.
Who knows what that is, you know.
Yeah. Well, that's a Catholic doctrine. And Calvin and Luther got that from earlier Catholic doctrine. The early Christians believed that their salvation was in Christ, and the sacraments being the earliest in pericope in some sense, the earliest things to make the rounds before there was any written New Testament. These things were repeated and repeated and repeated, and baptism was the way to access Christ. And so you didn't want to prohibit a child who might die before they can make a decision from being entering into the person of Christ. And so that's the theology that's there. You want to make sure that grace is imparted at the get-go.
But the theology that has impressed me in my latter years has been going back to the debate between Augustine and Pelagius and Celtic spirituality. And we talked last week about what it means to be created in God's image and to be created a sinner. I have trouble with that being in God's image.
Yeah. Well, I think that's why it's, that's Roy, that's why I find these three chapters so helpful. So I would say we start off the spiritual business, which is Greek, as you know. We start off in God's image in these stories, and I think it's helpful. And we ourselves become fallen. So it's not that it's God's intent or that God builds it in. We built it in being human. And I think from an evolutionary standpoint, there is something to be said for that.
But Pelagius, emphasized the fact that we start out, like you said, in God's image and the seed of goodness in us, to express it.
Right.
And then we bury it as we get fallen. We bury it under all the darkness of our lives and the sinfulness and whatever.
Yeah. And I think
when you're trying to help people get over their feeling of themselves, there's a difference between saying, you were created a sinner and you need to get saved versus you were created in goodness.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can get back to what you have deep down inside of you and what you are.
Yeah, I Roy, you're enough of a theologian to know what I'm saying when I say this. Theology is handy as long as it's handy. One of the problems we encounter is that it breaks down on the edges. So I would say both Pelagius and Augustine are right. We start off with the weight of our humanity, which brings with it all the gray stuff and the knowledge of the fruit, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. But there is the good. There is the hunger for God. That there is also. We want to be better. And we want to be better from a very young age. So those two forces are constantly in a dialectical conflict. That is, they're built in this dialectical tension between the two of them. And I think that's just a part of our humanness. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it defines the choices we make and provides us the opportunity to attain a higher level of life that we see in Christ. That's what I would say. I'm not gonna. I don't know about you, but I understand these 2 points of view. I think we need to. I think both of them are useful, but I like the way the story goes because we start off in God's image, right, and then we screw it up.
I like your statement that theology is useful as long as it's useful.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right, we have a question. Karen Conrad's got her hand up. Unmute, Karen.
Yeah, you were talking about your conversion, your immediate conversion.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, but I'm very intrigued by that. Were you an atheist, or did you just not believe in Jesus? Did you believe in God and then discovered Jesus, or could you share your story with us?
I can try. I've never been good at this. Very difficult to do. And I'm not trying to be evasive, but to have that experience for me was unspeakable. I mean, I can't talk about it with any sense that I'm confident. I'm telling you what I experienced the way I would like to. I would say at the point of my conversion, I was philosophically agnostic. I was smart enough to know both philosophically, which I've had some, and also as a scientist, we can't prove or disprove God. There have been a gazillion efforts at it, and I'm sure you're aware of many of them, but we can't carry that off with any finality to the point where we can be confident that's absolutely it, the final word, there's no disputing it. And as I said, the attempt has been made. So I had this philosophical predisposition to agnosticism, but I looked upon faith as, as an unnecessary mythology that was kind of baked around our more scientific our empirical understanding. The experience that I had, I was at Brown. It was one night, and I was working on a paper that I was writing, and I just had this sudden and it was a story. It was about religion and culture in society, and I had this old Bible that my dad had given me when I was a boy. And I kept it around because it was like having these other sacred texts. It was or ethnographic works of religions. And I flipped it open, and it had been years and years, decades since I'd been even looking at it. And I started flipping, and I landed on the last passage in Matthew. And as you know, and I will never forget, that Jesus says to his people, go into all the world and baptize everyone. And I'm with you always to the end of the age. And all of a sudden, I had this overwhelming sense of the presence of Christ. It really gets difficult to say how that's experienced. I mean, it's not like they were seeing something concrete, but it was like everything was just filled with this vibrant, enlivened sense of love. The presence of this love. And I was just shocked. I mean, frankly, I was just totally floored. And I sat there for, I don't even know how long. I mean, guess hours. And then I got up, and it was one of those cold East Coast nights, and walked around for hours, 3 or 4 hours in the snow, trying to kind of recollect what the heck just happened there. What does it mean? Well, what it meant was, I can't just be a scientist anymore. I mean, I love it. I still love it. I love to read my articles and books and so on, but it's not enough. So that's when I decided I had to, so I quit and went to Vanderbilt to find out more about this Christ event, and that's been the story of my life ever since. And that's about all I can say. I mean, it's very difficult to describe what that experience does. I mean, it just totally blows up everything else and puts it in a whole different order. I mean, then all of a sudden it becomes, how am I to live? What am I to believe? Well, one thing for sure is I believe God. There is a God. There is a force. Now, as Christians, we believe it's the Holy Spirit. But I would subsume that under the Christ event. That's how I knew it as a momentary Christian. And I could very easily sing Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound, the hour I first believed. I don't know.
But when you've had an experience like that, nobody can convince you it's not real. Sorry, Karen, go ahead.
No, I was just, thank you for sharing that.
Well, I'm sorry I can't do better, Karen. I mean,
no, you told your story. It was wonderful.
But it's a shabby telling of greater truth.
I'm envious because that you got to experience that.
That's interesting. Karen. Yeah, I will tell you that ever since I came to Vanderbilt, actually, and was there as a student now, and then went into the ministry, I've had many people tell me that's true in one way, and the other way is it takes over your life. So you better be ready to walk away from everything. I mean, it's that commanding. So then, that's when but God had plans. I mean, I'm loving the plans that God worked out, because I came to divinity school. I met my wife. I had my children. We went up into the mountains and worked with these people who were desperately poor, who knew a lot more about living as a Christian than I ever did at that time, than I learned in divinity school with all the academics. These were people who lived on the edge with profound faith in a sense of God's glory, even in the midst of the most terrible hardship. And they were able to teach me a little of that. So I loved the plan, but I mean, I didn't see it coming in, and it is a wondrous gift. And it's also an unending burden. I mean, I'm grateful for it, but I wouldn't want to misrepresent it.
I'm glad Karen asked that question because I wanted to ask it when I introduced you, but I didn't want to take the time back then. Our time is pretty well gone, but I have one more question that's in the chat room. And David, you can answer this or I can answer this. Somebody asked, would you ask for a clear definition of what original sin even is?
Help yourself, Roy.
Well, to combine what you said there at the end about both, not either or, but both, it would be the belief that human beings are born with a tainted or sinful nature and with a proclivity towards sinning.
Mm-hmm.
That's from the time of our birth, from the time we were born into this world.
Yeah, and I think that we see that, not to be a bore about it, but I think we see it in the dawn of our species. I think we can see this conflict developing, this fear and this hunger and this hope and this yearning toward God, meaning, it's there at the beginning. And so is our screwed upness.
I like that answer, that we've got both working in us. That's a good answer.
And I think we can all experience it. Incidentally, I want to say before we bail here, Roy, that to all your people, your Woodmont people, you got some smart folks here. I've been in the ministry a long time, and you've got some really good ones. So I'm out.
We believe in all the scripture. It says, love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength.
Yeah.
So, David, we thank you. I didn't see any other hands raising their questions. So I want to thank David for being with us tonight and remind all of you that next Wednesday is Ash Wednesday, and we will have a service, I know, in the new chapel of the church, spaced out and everything that we're supposed to, at 6:00, an Ash Wednesday service. And then 2 weeks from tonight, Rubel Shelley, who's no stranger here at Woodmont, has taught classes. In fact, he taught with Clay back in January. He'll be with us during Lent to do a Bible study. And I'm trying to remember, I think he said he's going to do the Gospel of Mark. Don't totally count on that. Read your spire, but it will tell you that 2 weeks from tonight, we will begin that study. So again, thank you, David. And I would invite us to close with a word of prayer.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Most holy God, we do give you thanks for David Kidd and what he represents, not only as someone who has known you and committed to you and realized the importance of putting you first, but also he represents the unity of all your believers across denominations, across all the theological and doctrinal divisions. May we always keep that in mind. And when we get into discussions about how we interpret or what our theology or our doctrine is, let us always keep the bigger picture in mind, that we all want to belong to you. And we're trying our best to understand, but more importantly, to live in the way that Jesus taught us. We pray in his name. Amen.